Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Business Insights room. Every Thursday, Tim Sullivan and I, Mai Matsuoka, lead a discussion looking for insights, developments, and new opportunities for the business in Japan. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions. So if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the discussions on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. This morning, we're pleased to welcome Richard Berger, Director of Communications at Link Global Solution. Today, Richard talks about the language as a tool of communication, the difficulty of using Japanese language in business settings, and specific phrases to watch out for when communicating in Japanese.
You can use a pencil to write a mundane shopping list, or you can use it to create like an almost photorealistic drawing. So, how you use it will entirely reflect on the results that you get. So we're going to start with the good news. It's always good to start off on a positive foot here. So in terms of phonology, Japanese, as we all know, is simple and straightforward. So the pronunciation is not that challenging, but of course for U.S. Or English speakers, it's kind of hard to really nail the proper Japanese pronunciation in terms of what would you call it, I guess, rhythm and accent, especially coming from English. The accent can be a tremendous challenge to speak in the way that Japanese native speakers do. Also, the verbs, this is great news, with only two exceptions, they're all conjugated in a consistent manner. So I sometimes, after learning how Japanese verbs conjugated, I kind of looked with a fresh eye on English verbs, and wow, I have just immense respect for how non-native English speakers have learned and mastered the language, because that's just, wow, English is a mess. There's also no conjugations aren't affected by first, second, and third person. If you look at the verb to be in English, I am, you are, he or she, it is, and then we, you, they are. You don't need to worry about any of that in Japanese, which is it's great. And to top it all off, there are no masculine or feminine nouns. That's a concept that I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around in French, and is it Spanish as well, I believe. But then again, on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have the immense challenges that Japanese poses to non-native speakers, especially those from English-speaking countries. The sentence structure is just so different. And I still vividly recall really trying to get used to that structure, because obviously in the early days, I was thinking in English and trying to speak in Japanese, and it was just really, really difficult to kind of get comfortable with the subject, object, verb sentence structure, which I'm sure we've all struggled with. The writing system, I mean, just from the get-go, we can't rely on the alphabet that we're so used to. And then to top it all off, if hiragana and katakana weren't challenging enough, then you have to deal with kanji, and that's, as we all know, just a real challenge. And I've seen time and time again from people who've mastered the language, and I have come to think this way as well, that if you really, really, really want to speak Japanese fluently, you have to learn kanji. There's just no way around it. I know some people think that they can kind of skirt the issue, but it's just a must. So bad news for any of you out there who might be kind of starting your Japanese learning journey right now. Do not avoid kanji. Embrace it. Celebrate it. Cry in your beer over it. But kanji is just a must.
Right.
The vocabulary, also made up of kanji, can be really challenging when you have compounds made up of two or more kanji. And once again, that just requires an understanding of kanji. You've got these homonyms. Sometimes they sound the same, and you may know only one or two of them, and the person you're speaking with is referring to another one. If you understand the kanji, if they show it to you or tell you what it is, you might have this kind of aha moment. It's like, oh, okay, I get what you're saying here. Another immense challenge that we're all familiar with is the levels of politeness. Um, I think it was the anthropologist Chie Nakane who said that described Japan as a tate shakai, kind of a vertically structured society, and it's very hierarchical in nature, and obviously Japanese language reflects that. So this is kind of something that English speakers have never really had to deal with. Of course, you can speak politely and you can speak courteously in English, but the nature of how you reflect that in Japanese versus English is just, it's a very different approach. And keigo, if you're going to be speaking Japanese in a business setting, you have to learn keigo. There's just no ways around it. And then there's some random craziness. I remember when this kind of reflects the hierarchical nature of the Japanese language, but I remember it might have even been the first day in Japanese 101 when I learned that there was more than one word for the first person singular I. In English, it's I, it's one letter, it's one syllable. It's something that is used frequently, so it needs to be as short and succinct as possible. I think in Spanish, it's yo, which is also, a single syllable because you use it so often, so frequently. You just need to be able to throw it out there. And on a day one, I learned that the Japanese word for I was watakushi. And it's like, whoa, we are not in Kansas anymore. 4 syllables for I. And I thought that was just crazy. It's like, that's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a lot of time to say it. Little did I know at the time that it's very rare that you ever use the first person singular. And then there were variations of it. There was watashi. This was a long time ago. And I think they had for females, they recommended atashi, which is something you probably really hear today. And then boku. And it's like, wait, why are there multiple ways to say I? Why is that even necessary? And then this is something that I always like to throw out. The adjective, the Japanese adjective for warm is atatakai. And then when I learned the past tense of that, I was floored. Atatakakatta. I mean, you have to have some pretty developed pronunciation skills to kind of roll that off. Atatakakatta. I thought, okay, any language that knowingly creates a word that requires that level of diligence in pronunciation has got to be crazy. And in my later experience with the language, I was not disappointed. So, okay, we're kind of talking about the basics of the Japanese language here, and just to kind of tie it all up, the mechanics of Japanese are pretty straightforward, grammatically as well. I didn't mention that a moment ago, but with the sentence, with the conjugations. So at this point, you might kind of question, okay, well, what makes it, all that challenging? But once again, because the mechanics of Japanese are pretty straightforward, getting a working knowledge of the language is not really that hard from a grammatical perspective. And if you apply yourself and, work on expanding your vocabulary, it won't really take that much time before you can, kind of find your way around the city without much problem. You can make friends. You're going to have basic conversations. You can enjoy nights out drinking, once the restrictions have been lifted, of course. So if it's not all that hard to achieve a level of facility in Japanese, what makes it so hard to use it in a business setting? Well, first of all, once you kind of develop a working knowledge, this is something that we talked about a couple of weeks ago as well. Once you develop a working knowledge and a basic facility in Japanese, the odds are quite high that you're still thinking in English and just converting what you want to say in Japanese. And as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, that approach I have come to learn will only get you so far. So let me give you actually a reverse example. One language and speaking in another can get you in trouble. This is something, for those of you who don't know, up until about 5 or 6 years ago, I worked at Canon, the office equipment and camera and now medical equipment manufacturer. I worked there in public relations for 20 years. And this is something that I saw and experienced firsthand on many occasions. Um, as you may know, it's not unusual for Japanese managers, Japanese workers to be sent overseas, to be posted overseas to work for 3, 5, or more years in locations, overseas locations. And I would see time and time again Japanese managers who were sent to English-speaking countries and put in charge of, a division there. Uh, they would I could see when I visited them, or when I saw them speaking to their team members, I could the thought process was really quite clear to me. It was obvious, even though they had a pretty good facility, English speaking abilities. I could see when there were instances when they were clearly thinking in Japanese and kind of just directly translating into English. And one phrase that they would use that would get them in trouble time and time again. And if you know Japanese, shinakereba narimasen, shinakereba ikemasen, shinakute wa ikemasen. So we all know that is, you must do something, or you have to do something. And actually, in Japanese business settings, in English that sounds quite harsh, but it's frequently used in Japanese. And even though it might sound harsh in English, it's depending on the tone and the context and the way that particular phrase may be delivered, it doesn't come off, as sounding as rough and abrasive as it does in English. So, I've been told that many times, you got to be more careful here, or you have to take in consideration this when you're writing this press release. So I was very used to it. But when I would go and visit my, colleagues at Canon USA or somewhere else in an English-speaking country, the Japanese manager would say, "You must do this. You must be careful when you write this press release, or when you talk to the journalist." And as soon as it came out of their mouth, even to me, knowing where it was coming from, really, kind of set my teeth on edge. And I could see in the expressions of the people who were receiving this feedback, it was really annoying them. It was really irritating them. And, it goes without saying that kind of insensitivity to language can really create a lot of challenges in the workplace. So this is just one example of kind of a reverse case where someone was essentially directly translating something that was acceptable in Japanese into English and getting in trouble as a result. So basically, to kind of get us back on track to what we're talking about, if you're thinking in English for native English speakers, and you've got an ability to be understood in Japanese and to understand what the other person is saying, essentially you're still working with only a rudimentary understanding of Japanese, and that will not really get you very far in a Japanese business setting. So to really understand how Japanese and what makes Japanese even more challenging, more difficult in business settings, we have to enter the realm of intercultural communication. And this is something that Tim is obviously well versed in, and I encourage him to jump in if he's got some examples or some additional insight to share. But one of the key concepts that really needs to be understood, and once again, I'm sorry if this is territory that has been well worn and is well known by the Japan hands out there. But even for me, I had worked at Canon for 20 years before I took my first intercultural communication training. And that was a real eye-opening experience. So maybe I will touch on some aspects that might be new or eye-opening to some of you out there who are very, very familiar with Japan and the Japanese culture and language. So first of all, one of the key concepts is something it's called high context culture and low context culture. And this was a concept that was introduced by Edward T. Hall, who was an American anthropologist and cross-cultural researcher. I'm reading a definition here, but high context and low context refers to the degree of importance that context plays in communication. So let me break that down and explain it a little more easier to understand terms. But low context cultures, and three representative low context cultures are that of the United States, the Netherlands, and Germany. So in low context culture, they take a more explicit approach to communication. It's pretty clear, what is expressed in the words that are used. It leaves little doubt for confusion. It doesn't require that you read between the lines. And on the other end of the continuum, so it is kind of a continuum where we have on one end the low context cultures and on the other end high context cultures. But in high context cultures like those of Japan, Korea, and primarily other Asian countries, but the approach to communication tends to be more nuanced. And there's a great Japanese saying that probably many of you are familiar with in Japanese. This is ichi o kiite ju o shiru. So you hear one and you fill in a gap between 2 and 10 and you understand 10. So it's to hear one and understand 10. And that's really what's expected in a high context culture, that you hear the words, but that you take in other information, maybe visual cues like body language, the tone of the voice. And also, there's an assumption that there is a shared background, a shared understanding of what's behind the words that are being used to express the message. So it's really a challenge for cultures that are not familiar with such this approach to communication. It's really difficult for them to understand what is being said. This is an example that I gave in one of my posts on LinkedIn, but there's a well-known for Americans, there's a well-known humor columnist named Dave Barry. And back in the 90s, I think maybe the late 90s, he wrote a book called Dave Barry Does Japan. And he took a 3-week trip to Japan with his family and kind of wrote down his experiences and what he learned through that vacation. And his wife at the time, I believe he's got a different wife now, but his wife at the time was working with a Japanese travel agent to arrange all their traveling within the country. And one of the conversations that he highlighted in his book discussed his wife's attempts to book plane flights in Japan, domestic flights. And she wanted to go from one place to another. And so she told the travel agent, I'd like to take a plane from, this place to this place. And the travel agent said, a plane. Wouldn't you rather like to take a train? And she said, no, I would rather prefer to take a plane. And the travel agent was saying, from place A to place B, right? And she said, yes. I think maybe you'd enjoy a train. And the wife was getting increasingly frustrated and saying, no, I want to take a plane. And basically, this was the travel agent's high context way of telling Dave Barry's wife that there are no planes. You cannot book a flight from place A to place B because they don't exist. The only way you can get from place A to place B is by train. But she wasn't picking up the high context cues. So they're going around and around in a circle. And Dave Barry, he does a very good job of explaining that his wife was on the verge of pulling her hair out because she wasn't being understood. But from the travel agent's perspective, it was the wife that wasn't understanding what was being said. So this is kind of a classic example of high context communication and how things can get lost, as they say in translation. Okay, that said, that doesn't mean that low context cultures are incapable of high context communication. Now, I know that I have heard from my British friends that actually the UK is positioned slightly higher on the low context, high context continuum than the US is. So there are some nuanced high context expressions that are understood between British people that might be lost on Americans. I understand that when a British person says something is interesting, it can often mean that it is not interesting. It is ridiculous. It is stupid. So that is one example of a English-speaking, generally viewed as low-context society using high-context communication. So if you don't share that background, if you don't share that understanding, you're going to miss the message that is trying to be delivered there. And also with, like, even American couples, a couple that has been together for decades, maybe something as subtle as a raised eyebrow, a clearing of the voice, a chuckle, that can speak volumes between those two people who understand, who share the context and understand what, that raised eyebrow may mean, or family dynamics. In a family, the father may make some offhand remark and everyone in the family knows what that means, but to a guest to that person's house, they may not know what, that means at all. So just low context and high context are not black and white. It's a very nuanced concept. But another aspect of Japanese communication that can be very, very challenging is silence, the role that silence can play in communication. In the intercultural communication training companies I work with, silence is a topic that is discussed at length. And the general understanding is that for Americans or for native English speakers, any extended periods of silence are immensely uncomfortable. I think, generally speaking, Americans can tolerate up to about 4 seconds of silence in communication before they get really, really uncomfortable and speak up. So if they're in a business meeting or a business setting with a Japanese person who speaks English, if silence ensues and lasts for about 4 or 5 seconds, then the American feels compelled to speak up. It has to break the silence, because silence to a low context English speaker means communication breakdown, and it's unacceptable. So knowing that, you can actually use that as a very, very powerful negotiating tool if you're aware of that concept. But for Japanese, they are very, very comfortable with silence. And silence to a Japanese person could mean something. They could be sending a message through their silence. To an American, silence means, the communication process has come to a screeching halt. To a Japanese person, it may indicate that they're thinking about something. They're contemplating, they're mulling over what has been said. Or it may indicate that the two parties have reached a complete level of trust that, really doesn't require much more to be said. It's actually quite comfortable that we've reached this level. It can, on the other hand, indicate confusion, or it can also indicate disagreement. It's well known that the Japanese aversion to conflict and the embracing of harmony, that can make Japanese people very hesitant to actually come out and say something negative or to reject an offer. But if you think about it, so now we've kind of laid out in the most basic of terms, there's the high context aspect of Japanese culture, and the embracing of silence, the emphasis on harmony and the aversion to conflict. So all of those ingredients mixed together create a recipe for disaster for native English speakers trying to communicate in business settings. So this is a common question that we ask in our intercultural communication training sessions. But how do Japanese people say no to a customer or business partner? Now, in the US, in English, if you need to reject a proposal, if you need to reject or turn down an offer, we're not that blunt about it. We'll say, that's a great proposal, but I'm sorry. At this time, I really don't see us having the budget to pursue that, or I'm afraid that's just not a direction that we would like to pursue at the moment. You break the news gently. You don't just come out and say, no, it's not going to happen. But in Japanese, there are various approaches. A very common one is to use the adjective muzukashii, which, of course, if you know what that means, it's difficult. But they don't just say it's difficult. They kind of quantify it or qualify it by saying, chotto muzukashii. It's a little bit difficult. Now, if you're a gung-ho, positive thinking, go-getter salesperson who's just made your proposal to a Japanese potential client, and you heard it's a little bit difficult, you're going to come back with, okay, tell us what the problem is, and we're going to fix it. We're going to make this work. We're going to make you happy. Just all we have to do is work out these wrinkles, because no little problem is going to be enough to derail us. But if you understood what chotto muzukashi really means, it means no, it's not going to happen. So do not come back with a counteroffer. Do not try to fix it. Chotto muzukashi means it's not going to work. So thank you, but no thank you. And there are more sinister, I don't know if that's the right word or not, but there are more nefarious ways to say no. And one of them that really, really I find very difficult to forgive is maemuki ni kento shimasu, which means we will positively consider your proposal. If you heard that from someone you just made an offer to, you're going to think, okay, this is in the bag. And what that really means is, once again, it's we're going to favorably look on this. We're going to favorably, positively consider this offer. I mean, there is nothing, absolutely nothing in that phrase to suggest that you're going to be rejected in the end, that it's not going to happen. But once again, if you share this background, if you share this context, you're going to know that that is a flat out no. And my heart goes out to interpreters who need to interpret negotiations of this nature. I don't know how they navigate these situations, because they know that it's a no, but is it really within acceptable parameters for them to come out and say no, or are they limited to the words that were actually used to deliver the no, which don't sound like a no? So once again, these are other ways that high context cultures, high context communication manifest themselves in the actual business language. Other things, and these are things that I have encountered too in the Japanese workplace, there are certain expressions that, for lack of a better word, can only be described as vague. And if you take them at face value, you're going to get in trouble. Whereas the Japanese person who spoke them was probably thinking that they were quite clear in the message they delivered. Some of them include dekireba, if possible. So I have been told time and time again, dekireba, if possible, can you do this for me today? So if you take that at face value, it's like, well, they're showing me the courtesy of saying, you probably have other things to do. So if possible, can you do this for me today? And at the end of the day, they come back and say, okay, where's that thing I asked you to do? And you say, well, you asked me possible, and I was swamped today. There was just no way I could get around it. To them, that dekireba, if possible, it meant I want it by the end of the day. But that is not, specifically what they said. It was kind of wrapped in this kind of vague package that didn't convey, at least to you, that they wanted it by the end of the day. Another way of saying is moshi jikan ga areba, if you have time, which sounds really courteous. It sounds really great. If you have time, can you translate this message for me, or this email that I want to send later today? And once again, the end of the day rolls by and said, where's that email? And it's like, well, actually, I didn't have time. And it's like, well, that's not what I meant, but that's what you said. Well, that's not what I meant, and you should have known it. And once again, that causes confusion and disappointment and other, kind of undermining your ability to do the job that they think you can do. Other ways, like if you request something, they might say, sono uchi ni, before long, or chikai uchi ni, sometime soon. But usually they're not given deadlines. They're not given delivered in concrete terms, in terms of in a week's time or in the next day or two. So these are also vague expressions that can really cause confusion or disappointment between people who are not on the same page, so to speak. Also, as we all know, Japanese embrace formality, and this is also reflected in the language, the things they say, the way they comport themselves. And then in after hours, once the social time starts after the final bell has rung and you're going out drinking or, going out to karaoke or something like that, then you see a completely different side, and you realize how open and how relaxed Japanese people can be. But if you try to kind of bring that into the office the next morning, you can find yourself in a lot of trouble. I've heard many disaster stories about a business person who comes out. They do the negotiations during the day, very formal. The necktie is properly straightened. Top button is buttoned, and very stiff and formal. And then they go out for a night of drinking, and suddenly, there's this level of casualness and craziness, and you become best buddies. And then the next morning, back in the office, when that Japanese business person comes back to the office and tries to recreate that wonderful, warm, rosy setting that they enjoyed the night before, then suddenly it causes the business person or the Japanese business people, the Japanese business side, to lose face, and then suddenly the deal falls through. So there's this kind of very heavy line of division that separates these two worlds, and if you're unable to understand that and respect that, then that can also cause a tremendous amount of disappointment in the workplace. Other aspects that people who've done business in Japan are more than familiar with is that the decision-making process can be immensely slow, glacially slow, time-consuming. Part of that is due to the requirement to achieve group consensus, and just the demand for tremendous amounts of information and details and things like that. And there's also just an immense amount of time required to build trust between people. I read a wonderful essay yesterday in President by one of the members who are in the audience today, Mr. Timothy Langley, and in it he talks about Ishino ue ni mo 3 nen, so spending 3 years sitting on top of a rock, and which is another Japanese proverb that requires the amount of time that needs to be taken to build trust. So if you join a Japanese company and you're in the workplace there and thinking you're just going to shake things up, and your great proposals and ideas for new advertising campaigns or whatever they might be are going to be immediately adopted, embraced, and applauded, you've got another thing coming. So you really just have to stick it out and be immensely patient and wait for your abilities to be recognized. And it's through that patience that they will be eventually recognized and respected. But if you try to shake things up, you're going to be in for a lot of disappointment. Another thing that can be a real shock, especially people from low context countries, is Japanese meeting styles. When I started joining the weekly meetings in the PR department at Canon, it was like I was attending a wake, a funeral. No one was speaking except the manager. He was just speaking, and everyone else was just completely silent. No one was offering their ideas. No one was offering feedback. So that to me was a real shock, and required a tremendous amount of willpower on my part not to interrupt and speak up and offer my great ideas or proposals for how we can improve things in the PR department. That was also a tremendous challenge for me. Also, there's a tendency, and this is something that Tim has spoken on and written about on LinkedIn, but this kind of focus on negative aspects. Japanese love to give negative feedback, to highlight all the negative aspects, and it's through that approach that they want to aspire to better things, for Kaizen, to reach new heights and improve things. But time and time again, after we'd hold these major events, the PR department might hold press tours, or we'd host a stand at some kind of event, and then immediately afterward they would hold what they would call a hanseikai, which is kind of a reflective. It could have been a tremendous success. It could have exceeded all of our highest wishes for success. The goals that we set for ourselves, the targets we set for ourselves, but the first thing to do is a hanseikai, which, to me, it sounds like we need to reflect on what went wrong, what we did wrong, and what we could do better. And it's like, wait, can we do that after the celebration? Because I can't think of a single thing that we did wrong. So it was really kind of a letdown and a bummer for me, for them to emphasize all of these negative aspects after we had this immense successful event or project. But all these things together, Japanese business settings, to me, are kind of the culmination of all of these aspects, these cultural aspects of Japan and the country. And it makes it exceedingly challenging for non-native speakers, especially those from English-speaking countries, to kind of grasp all of that and reflect it all in a business setting, in their business Japanese. So, once again, this whole session for me, for which I apologize, is kind of a mess. It's just a hodgepodge of concepts that I threw out there. But all of these things just pose challenges that require experience, patience, understanding, powers of observation in the workplace for you to really apply your Japanese and make it work in a business setting. So in a very, very kind of messy nutshell, that's kind of my message of why you need to use Japanese at your own risk. And I'm sure that probably the members who have joined us this morning can offer some wonderful examples of mistakes that they've made, faux pas, flub ups that I, for one, would love to hear. But Tim, Maya, that kind of touches on all the things that I wanted to cover this morning.
Well, thank you so much. You made so many points, and I can't unpack all of them. There's a couple I just wanted to highlight because they were excellent points, and this is kind of, as you mentioned, my area as well. You kind of started out with the very important thing to point out that language is a tool, and it's how you use it. And you use the analogy of a pencil. I use a car. A car gets you from point A to point B, and the car can be a useful tool, but if it's not properly used, it can also be used as a weapon to hurt people, even inadvertently. And the analogy I use is you can learn the mechanics of how to drive a car, which would be equivalent to learning how to speak a foreign language and, learning the grammar. But if you don't understand the cultural, I call them rules of the road, for example, that you're supposed to drive on the left side of the street instead of the right side of the street, the way you do in your own country, then now that car ceases to be a tool and becomes a weapon, and you can actually offend people. And I learned this the hard way because I started learning the Japanese language before I learned culture. So I think that was a really good point that you make. And I know of some people who speak, they're non-Japanese, they speak excellent Japanese, but they tend to offend people, and they don't have a lot of friends. And so it's not just how well you learn the language. And I think that's part of the point that you were making, and what I think was a great presentation. So the high context thing, I feel like one way to explain it is the Japanese have not only shared experience, but there's a lot of shared knowledge. And some of it is because of the hierarchy that's built into it. The Japanese often use the word joshiki, common sense. To the Japanese who live here and grew up here, it's common sense. Obviously, they're foreigners. They might not consider that a common sense. And so the analogy I use is because of the Japanese, for example, education system, they all have virtually identical educations, at least through, high school. They have this shared database of information that, which is part of that high context model, versus my culture, which has a decentralized education system. So, for example, Richard and I are both Americans, but it's highly likely we studied completely different things in elementary school and high school, right? So there's even information gaps between fellow Americans, and therefore we have to be explicit in our communication to fill in those gaps and compensate for the lack of that shared database, right? So I think those were great points. I love how you talk about how the Japanese say no, and I have one anecdote. It's not mine. It's a guy named Mark Zimmerman. He wrote a book. I read it in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was like doing business with the Japanese. And he had been here a long time. He was a drug salesman. And he was with the companies in Tokyo for many years. And then he changed companies, moved back to the States. And then he visited Japan to visit one of his customers that he had worked with for 20 years in hopes of getting them to switch to his new company. Of course, they didn't say no. They were very polite, and then they took him out and wined him and dined him and treated him like a king. And he said that was their way of telling me, we really like you, Mark. You're our friend. We value the relationship, but we're not going to use your product. So somebody less knowledgeable about culture wouldn't have picked up on those signals.
Thank you for doing that, Richard, because everything you said resonates perfectly with me, point by point, word by word. And one thing which I remember somebody saying, when I was still learning Japanese, it was like, and I was struggling, of course, in the office because with the keigo and the teinego and everything, and I made a lot of mistakes. And somebody said, another foreigner, I just don't remember, we were talking online or somewhere, and then they said, you may be able to speak the language perfectly, but if you haven't heard a native speaker use that expression in a given situation, chances are that you'll use the expression in the wrong way. So it was really revealing to me. And so as Tim likes to say here, and of course in other cultures too, but particularly here in Japan, everything is very situational. So you have to be aware of different situations and how the expressions are used there in those situations. But also it means that you need experience. You just cannot fake experience here. If you haven't been through such moments, really chances are very high that you use even teinego or keigo in the wrong way, and sometimes it could be offensive to the other people, in the business setting. So I think that for me personally, one of the biggest takeaways from my experience here in Japan is to be always open and listening and observe how people behave, especially native speakers of the Japanese language, how they behave, what they say in certain situations, and try to memorize that. But, well, that's me, and maybe for others it's different.
That is an excellent point, and I was very, very lucky to work at Canon for 20 years, and I was the only, well, for many of the years I worked there, I was the only non-Japanese in the room, on the floor actually. And we're talking about a floor with literally several hundred workers. It was in the headquarter building. And just kind of seeing and experiencing all of that around me, and the word we've been using a lot today is context, but just seeing how the language was used in context was the most valuable education that I could have ever received. No matter how much I may have, studied or trained in the classroom or through textbooks or other lessons, there's just no way I could have achieved that level of comfort or understanding any other way. I remember very early when I was studying Japanese, a story that one of my language teachers told me about. There was an American guy, and he spoke very good Japanese, and this was in Japan, and the Japanese language teacher introduced him to, I believe, a tea ceremony teacher. And when when the teacher told the tea ceremony teacher about this student, I think he said, "Oh, he speaks very, very good Japanese, and and he wants to study with you." And so the tea ceremony teacher was happy to take this, this guy on as a student. And when they spoke with each other, the tea ceremony teacher said, "So, where are you from?" And he said, he was thinking, "I want to." The student was trying to convey a very casual, friendly air, and in doing so, California. So this, he was conveying in the language he used this casualness, and it ended up offending the tea ceremony teacher. And the tea ceremony teacher said, "I don't want to take him on as a student because I found him very rude." And it was because he was not using, he could have assumed that air and that tone, but he wasn't using the right words. And in doing so, he offended the tea ceremony teacher, and was not allowed to be accepted as a student. And I often hear beginning students of Japanese, of course, the first level of politeness they learn is the desmas form. And if they're maybe international students studying in Japan, and they're hanging out with their friends, they rarely hear that form used, and they all bitch and complain about no one uses that form. It's even teach it, and I just kind of have to shake my head and say, if you only knew the trouble you can get yourself in, if you only know the casual form, the dictionary form, uh, it may once you reach a certain level of understanding, you will understand with complete clarity why the des mas form is so important to start with. But that's just me.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And I remember that when I started studying Japanese here after I came to Japan, the only form which I was taught was desmas. So it was really funny because I kept, using that desmas even in my family with my husband. And it was like, oh, come on, are you trying to put a, distance between us or something like that? But for me, it was still very unusual to use the casual form, the dictionary form of the verb. And it continued, for, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years until eventually my friends in Hokkaido, somebody told me, okay, you should stop doing that, at least when we are in a non-formal setting. So it was the eye-opener for me, but yeah, it's really important. So, and it basically, it's much safer to use the desmas form inappropriately than to use the dictionary form inappropriately. So if I can make this comparison.
Kind of one important point that I think it's worth mentioning is every time I worked in a Japanese company, or even not in a Japanese company, I always had somebody I developed a close relationship, a native Japanese speaker, and I consulted with them often on the proper Japanese to use in a certain situation. I would bounce things off them, so they were kind of like my friend and private teacher behind the scenes that would coach me. And I think it's really, really important to find somebody like that, and it's about building a relationship. So anyway, Mai, did you want to get to Yuka-san?
Yeah, I'm here now.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Richard. Thank you again for a great session. First when I saw the subject line for this club today, I thought, I'm going to skip this because I don't think I have, as a native speaker, I don't think I will have an issue speaking in Japanese in business setting. But oh boy, I was wrong, and I learned a lot. Thank you so much. I have a question. It's sort of like I don't know, it's maybe a different angle. I just learned really like last week, the interpretation, of a message is like a 7% verbal, like a 38% vocal, and so the rest is like a what, 55% visual. So like a 93% of communication is non-verbal. Now, because you speak both Japanese and English, do you think these stats are kind of universal, like applicable to both languages or both culture? Or maybe in my gut feel, I think Japanese tend to be more non-verbal. So what is your take on this? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the kind words. I think that Japanese and also probably most high context cultures, they are much more sensitive. They have their antenna very finely tuned to a lot of things. So I would, once again, this is not my area of expertise, but I would think that generally speaking, Japanese and other people from other high context cultures are really, really quite sensitive to all the information that's coming in. Much of which might be visual in nature, like the body language, the tone of voice, the use of silence, and things like that. So I would agree with your assumption there, personally. What do you think, Tim?
I think there's a lot more, Ammoku no Ryokai in high context languages, certainly Japanese. But I've heard similar statistics. They're not exactly the same. Who knows what the percentage is, but it aligns with what I've studied as well in general terms. And, I guess it makes sense. And I never thought of distinguishing it between languages. So that's a really good point, Yuka. And I agree with you. I agree. I have the same gut feeling, but I have no way of quantifying it.
Well, do we even worry about how to bow at certain people? How deep we should bow, or do we I haven't been to Japanese business settings, so I'm just for my a reference. do we have to worry about that now? Still, thank you.
I think we can ask Tomoko and Ren. So what's your take on this, Tomoko?
Yes, it's important to know how degrees you should do at certain scenes. So you need to be careful.
Right.
If you vary the degree is too not sharp enough, then you may cause lots of trouble. Like empty bow every week we tend to see from the news.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ren, what is your take on this?
We're talking about bowing.
Yes, in
Okay.
Japan and Japanese business settings, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I would actually say there's something more important than bowing. It's eye contact. When you are bowing, where are you looking at? So I think bowing is important, but probably even more important is when you should not look into your customer's eyes when you're bowing or when you are about to bow, right? And that is also very sensitive things. I'm sorry, I don't want to make things more complicating, but that would be my answer.
Oh, it's okay. I think I'm gonna take YouTube lesson for this. Thank you.
Right. Yes.
I believe what Ren said is absolutely correct, because as long as I remember, when I was young, I was told where to look when you have to bow for certain degrees. So it's very important not looking at somebody's eye, for instance, for the kind of psychiatric, but the most important point or important person or approaches situation.
That can be a real challenge, I think, for non-Japanese people when they first learn how to bow, because sometimes they want to maintain eye contact. They want to be looking at the other person, and it makes for a very ridiculous looking bow because they're facing up while bowing down. Also, as for where to look, I train in karate, and when you bow to your opponent, you look at his feet because you don't know if he's going to attack you, and you can tell if he's going to attack you by looking at his feet.
Right, that's interesting.
Yeah, but look at the feet is actually a really good way to think about where to look, because when you have to, for instance, when you have to apologize while you are looking at the eye, then it means you are not convinced you have to apologize. And it's a challenge. Even the person is apologizing, it's still challenging you to not apologizing, that kind of things. You have to read the body language of the Japanese people.
Maya, you could have an entire session on apologizing in Japanese, and you probably wouldn't have enough time. And I do not want to host it, just to let you know.
Okay, we'll see. But thank you for the idea. I think it's a great idea. Yeah.
Can we move to the some other topics about not the approach? So,
yes. So I guess you've got something to comment, and
yeah,
some
well,
topics.
actually, I forgot about.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, of course, I'm Japanese, so I know the Japanese language and culture, and also my education, my higher education, MA and BA, are actually from British University, so that it's rather more high context than Americans. So, in that sense, but even still, between Japanese people, sometimes I'm talking with the person with a feeling of hakuhyobufumu. It's really need to be very careful about what I verbally say to the person, and always try not to cross the line between. It's like a Humpty Dumpty feelings.
Okay.
That's one thing. So even for Japanese, sometimes it's really challenging. And the second thing is that when I was working for a company, the subsidiary of NTT, I was told from some of the employees from the company, that many NTT people seems to believe that NTT's common sense is everybody's common sense, but unfortunately, actually, the truth is the NTT's common sense is the non-common sense for the rest of the world. And it's very important to understand the company different company has got a different common sense. So also I had this similar discussion with the Toyota guy that what he knows about the Japanese culture, the Japanese corporate culture, is about Toyota. And he doesn't feel comfortable to say he knows about the culture from Nissan or Suzuki, for instance, or completely different industries. So even for Japanese, the high context culture is a bit challenging. So don't worry, those who have been struggling to understand the Japanese high culture, we all Japanese are struggling too sometimes.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that about the different company cultures, and well, come to think of it, I actually witness this every day in at my workplace, because I work for an association which has member companies. It's travel and tourism association here, and we've got all the major travel agencies in Japan as our members. And so they send people, for they second people to to the association for 2 or 3 or 5 years, and they come from all those different companies. And it's fascinating to see how their background actually gives them a very different way of, or well, it's interesting to observe their working styles. They are different. It's interesting to observe their ways of viewing the industry as a whole, because it's influenced by the company they come from. And it's so very different. So it's fascinating, really. And I appreciate the point you made, Tomoko. So thank you very much for this. And it's also nice to know that it's not only us, the silly foreigners who live here, who struggle with the culture. It's also, the Japanese people who have that difficulty sometimes too. Thank you very much. And Ren, are you still there?
Yes, I am still here. Thank you. In fact, thank you for bringing me up, Timothy and Maya. And always great room. I really appreciate it. And Richard, wow, that's a lot of information there. I really enjoy listening to every single word, phrase you mentioned. And so I thought I had to raise my hand to share my thought as well.
Thank you for coming up.
Thank you. Once I'm an engineer by training, and I like to share one thing there. For some reasons, the Japanese scientists are not fond of, do not like the scientific, or should I say engineering calculator, which is what we call a reverse Polish calculation. For those who do not know, most of the calculator, we put 1 + 1 equal, and you get the answer on the calculator, right? But the reverse Polish calculator, like those produced by HP, we use, 1 enter, 1 enter, and then we decide what you want to do with those two variables. We either do plus or minus at the end, which is very similar to Japanese grammar, right? But
Yes.
the Japanese scientists do not like it. And that is still a mystery to me. Maybe the Japanese people, they speak like that, but their engineering or scientific thinking is not like that. So that's my that's my conclusion at this point. But I don't have should I say, the scientific proof for that. So that's the first point I was going to share with you. And then the second point is that I think, Richard, you mentioned that China is also a high context culture, and also China is also one of the top 5 most challenging languages for foreign service personnel to learn. And I find it interesting that you mentioned that, because when I deal with the Chinese business people, I find them to be more straightforward. I feel like I'm talking to somebody from Silicon Valley. Yet they are high context culture people. And how do we balance that differences? I'm still not so sure. And on the other hand, when I'm in Taiwan, I find the people in Taiwan are a little bit somewhere between Japan and the US. That's my observation so far. And lastly, you work for Canon, I work for Panasonic, and I had my own share of challenges working for Kansai or Osakan companies being raised in Tokyo. And again, I don't want to make things even more complicating than what you already said, but I thought I wanted to bring that up. those are the 3 points. I hope they are entertaining enough to be shared. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Actually, you touched on a very important point about high context and low context cultures. And it's really important to kind of view them in terms of a spectrum. And Japan, according to some studies or some researchers, they believe Japan is the highest context culture. And on the opposite end, the Netherlands. So it's a matter of degree and it's relative. So from the perspective of a Japanese person, Chinese culture can seem quite low context, and relatively speaking, it is. But from someone from the U.S., say, or Germany, then they're looking in the other direction, and Chinese culture is very high context. Excuse me. I recall when I was working at Canon that the company acquired a Dutch printer manufacturer. And during that time, I was working with my counterpart in the Netherlands, from the head of public relations there, the communications director. And I was really taken aback by how kind of blunt or abrupt or direct that he was, and also the other Dutch people that I was communicating with. And once again, the U.S. is viewed as one of the lowest contact cultures on the spectrum, but the Netherlands is a little bit below that. So even from my perspective, it felt, I kind of experienced the same thing that you did in your dealings with, the Chinese people that you had to work with. So it's important to realize that we're talking about a continuum when talking about high context and low context cultures.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yes, and just I want to read, I got a message through the back channel saying that department stores also have different culture. I asked how it happened, and a manager told me they always recruited from the same university. It's about university culture, probably. This is from Claude. So obviously it works on different levels. I would like to believe that, of course, because Japan is such a high context culture, these differences are more pronounced here. But at the same time, probably it happens overseas as well, in cultures which are not so high context. Of course, because I come from Europe, a small European country, we all like to think that we are very different, and of course there are some differences too. But when you go, to different countries there, when you go to different companies, I believe that you always face the same problem of adaptation and the need to learn. So it's a continuous thing, indeed. And we've got Anton.
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me up onto the stage. I lived in Japan for almost a decade, and Richard's discussion was quite interesting. There's two things that I wanted to bring up, and one is, I think Japanese communication is really based on the concept of Ishin Denshin, really being able to understand what people are trying to convey to you without actually saying it in words. And I think it's a really important skill to pick up, because what I found is that when you work in a Japanese environment and you work with Japanese people and you learn to figure out what they're saying without expressing in words, it helps you in so many other cultures and environments. Mm-hmm. So that's one point that I want to bring up. And yes, Japanese people themselves, they struggle to understand each other at times. Japanese people have, many times, asked me if I mean a yes or a no, and they'd be nervous about communicating with me. So I don't feel it's just like a one-way thing, whereas, Japanese people understand each other and foreigners don't understand Japanese people. Sometimes it works the other way. And the other thing that I want to mention is about, using Japanese as a foreigner, because in my experience, to simplify it, there are two kinds of foreigners who speak Japanese in Japan. So I'm really simplifying it. You have the more, academic orientated people like Richard, people who are really into the writing system, reading, literature. They want to do things like translation. They really want to immerse themselves into the language and really master it. And maybe I'd consider myself as one of those people. And then you have the other people that just kind of learn Japanese just to get by. It's just kind of like a survival thing. They don't really want to learn Japanese. They just want to learn it just so they can, get a job, go shopping, talk to their Japanese wife or whatever. And that level of, that person is usually, they have a linguistic level of, let's say, like a 5-year-old. So they can speak Japanese casually and they don't know any keigo. So I had a lot of friends like this in Japan, a lot of foreign friends in Japan who spoke Japanese fluently, but their level was not beyond that of like a 5 or 6-year-old, to simplify it. And they worked in Japanese companies. And when they spoke to someone, a Japanese person who didn't speak any English at all, they would speak Japanese. And when they spoke to a Japanese person who spoke some English, they would always speak to them in Japanese. And those people seem to be the most relaxed. They didn't seem to be so, obviously they had issues with Japanese culture, but they seemed to be the most relaxed about their use of the Japanese language. They weren't worried about using keigo. I mean, they spoke like, a 5 or 6-year-old. It didn't really matter to them. It was just being able to communicate with Japanese people who didn't speak English was a bonus. But the problem is when you get to this kind of academic level, this advanced level, where you put pressure on yourself to think and act and speak like a Japanese person, it becomes extremely stressful. And I worked in a lot of environments, a lot of Japanese companies where there were no other foreigners. And, it can really wear you down and it's just never ending. So I think it's, in my final years in Japan, I just didn't really worry too much about what people thought about me. I still interact with Japanese people regularly. And sometimes, there are miscommunications and, if that's the case, then just so be it. I mean, just have to let it go. We can't be perfect. So that's just all I really wanted to share.
Thank you for that. When I started working for Japanese companies, and I spent, unbelievable amount of time on my emails. I sent to my colleagues and because I was worried about every single expression here and how it would, be, let's say, viewed and perceived and so on. And then on the way, at some point, I just realized that, from observations, of course, that sometimes there is miscommunication even between native speakers who email themselves. And so just like you, Anton, I stopped, spending so much time on on thinking about, the expressions which I use in the emails and when I speak with my colleagues too. But also, I believe that, of course, I've got that already experience, that critical mass of experience, which allows me to feel a little bit more relaxed than I used to in the beginning. So once again, of course, it depends on, if we go, by the, let's say, categorization, which you just talked about, that the simple one between those who want to master the language and those who want to just use it because, it's, it makes their life somehow easier. It's really different for everybody. But at the same time, yes, I agree. I have a friend, who she has been here for a very long time, maybe 35 years or so. And her Japanese is very good, but she speaks like somebody, like a blue collar worker here. And she's a woman, and that doesn't really sound very well, not only to her, but to people, like us who try to master the language. So it's interesting. It's different for everybody. And Tim, I'm sorry for cutting you. Just please go ahead and say what you wanted to say.
No problem. I just wanted to make one point, and this is based on my experience speaking Japanese in a business environment with Japanese folks, and even in everyday life. I found that if you, as the foreigner, the non-Japanese, show effort, sincerity, and humility in your attempts to communicate, the Japanese are very, very forgiving and they're very kind. And sometimes to a fault, because you might make a mistake and they won't tell you. And then you don't learn from the experience. But that's what your close friends are for. That's what your Japanese spouse is for. That's, your family, the people that you're close to. You want to have those people who will give you the feedback. But I still want to say, in general, one reason not to worry about making too many mistakes is because the Japanese are pretty forgiving as long as you show the right attitude and effort and humility. Agree? Disagree?
I agree on that. Yes, absolutely.
I agree too. And I was hoping you were going to make the other point that if you try to take your attempts to behave and communicate as a Japanese too far, you can creep out Japanese people.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
Yes,
So
indeed.
you really have to kind of I really like the point that Anton made, because you have to get comfortable in your skin. You have to kind of settle on who you are and how you're going to portray yourself when you speak Japanese. If you try to become Japanese, it's not going to work, and it's going to probably get the wrong reaction from Japanese people. So you kind of have to settle in with what you're comfortable with, and how you want to kind of project and portray yourself.
Yeah, I coined a term to describe what you just mentioned, Richard. I call it, you have to find your own cross-cultural sweet spot, where on the one hand you're authentically who you are, but you're adjusting enough to connect with people.
And Tim, I think that it really goes well, or probably it will, transmission into the theme which we talked about this morning, adapting to the culture of the country which you live in, and how much you adapt, and how on the way, you either get too adapted, or you never actually get there.
Right. I know. And the two extremes are, on the one hand, some foreigners come to Japan and they stay in their foreigner bubble. And even though they've lived here a long time, they never really engage locally with the people. Right. And then the other extreme, and I kind of found myself in these shoes, is when I was here for 10 years, I almost overly adapted, and it wasn't intentional. It wasn't on purpose, but there actually are genuine things that I have adapted that I like about Japan. But then I went back to America and I kind of rediscovered myself. And I've come, 30 years later, I moved back to Japan, and I feel like I've kind of found myself, and I've gotten better at finding that balance. As again, Richard said, I found my cross-cultural sweet spot, right? So yeah, that is an interesting theme.
It is. Look, yes, please. Sorry for keeping you waiting. Please go ahead.
No, that's okay. I'm learning lots, and it brings back a lot of feelings of I've been in Japan for over, I think I stopped to count, but it's over 20 years, and my Japanese is okay. I work for a very small importer. I'm in sales. We do wine and spirits, so I'm in contact with Japanese every day. And I like the topic. I think it's about finding balance. I think what we're saying here now, just knowing your limits, like Tim said, finding your sweet spot, or just knowing what sort of business you're going to conduct today. Is it a negotiation with a mega company? Do I need to bring along a translator or somebody else into the conversation, or am I just meeting a friend, or it's a casual business coffee, or who am I actually meeting? I think it's just understanding the situation that you're going to be putting yourself in for business, and it's Japanese are very forgiving. I mean, of course, some people are not, like the tea ceremony person that Richard was mentioning, but that's an exception to the rule. I think what Tim was saying, Japanese are very forgiving. I mean, in business, it's business. People, they have their agenda in the background, and they're trying to get something from that meeting or from that particular deal. And you might not know what that is at the moment, but using Japanese, I think it's like any language. And even I speak English. If I go to the US or if I go to the UK, it's different again. So that's where I think it's just taking a moment to think, okay, what situation am I going to be in? And if I do speak Japanese, I have to know my limits. And sometimes I cross them, and I get told about it, or I get a frown, or he or she's not understanding me. So there's just so many good points here this morning, and thank you for everyone sharing. I think it's a very mixed bag because everyone is different.
Thank you for that, for the input. And I think that everybody's different, and for at least we all come from different backgrounds, and that's their cultural, educational, and so on. So whatever happens to each one of us is different, really, depending on that too. And then Ian.
Hi, yes. Sorry for the background noise. I'm applying to work right now. Um, I export tea, and I deal a lot with small companies in the countryside. Small companies meaning sometimes they're just like husband and wife and their son. Um, I was wondering if somebody could talk about the differences between small businesses and big businesses and rural and urban um, business cultures. Thank you.
That's an interesting point and a topic I think it deserves a different room. And I
I
think
was
that,
going to say that too.
yes, because we need to find people with relevant experience as well. Well, I personally have lived in Hokkaido, but when I was there, I lived in Sapporo. So even though Hokkaido is considered, it's not Tokai, it's not such a huge urban area. I still lived in Sapporo, so it's difficult for me, to make that parallel and to find the differences. But what I hear, well, my husband, his family is from Shizuoka, and they come from a small town which is on the western coast of the peninsula. And whenever we go there, it's really like a very, very tightly knit community. And well, my observations, and I'm sorry, it's different from business language, but still, this is just what I can say now at this moment, is that when they communicate, the people in that small community, when they communicate with each other, they use very colloquial Japanese. They don't worry about that. But when it comes to when they talk about work, so eventually their language changes. So because one of our cousins, when we go there, sometimes she talks about her work, and then her Japanese, her language becomes a little bit more formal, but we're still relatives. And I think that but yeah, it's really difficult. I'm sorry, just so difficult to talk about that now. Luke, I can see that your mic is
Yeah,
unmuted. Yeah, do you have anything?
yeah. Just quickly, and I think again down to communication, we have a lot of business settings that are not always in Tokyo, and so it could be in Tohoku, it could be in Okinawa, and they speak different dialects. So this is sort of also it's a pretty broad topic, but when going to those areas, everyone speaks basic Japanese, but I think it's in those areas when communicating with, say, smaller companies, and as Maya just alluded to, I mean, they have a different sort of culture going on in their own micro area. So I think taking an interest in that type of culture opens up the communication, and they'll understand, of course, basic Japanese. But I think if you can understand or take an interest in the local culture, that opens up the communication barriers that are there. And then dealing with the larger corporations that might be in Tokyo or could be in Sendai or other larger regions, Osaka. Larger corporations, they of course, it's just a different way of communication. It's again basic Japanese, but they're a little bit more formal, for example. So again, I think it's just like what I said before, just trying to read the situation and local communities are very focused on their area, and they really love their area. They're very passionate about their area. I think taking interest in that is the key to doing businesses in local areas. And corporations are a little bit the opposite. They're more focused on their company. So you really got to know a lot about their company in detail.
Interestingly, based on my experience when I was working at Canon, and we're talking, at Canon, that's a corporate behemoth. It's just this massive, massive company. But even within the company, you're going to see pockets that reflect different kind of sensibilities. So it's not kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, I think. So within the PR department, we had about, depending on, we grew, but about 10 to 14 people in the department. And that was kind of a close-knit community, and we would speak with each other in a certain tone, a certain level of formality. Then when we were, our customers, so to speak, were the media. And when we were talking with the journalists, we'd take a different tone. We'd also work with some of the top executives in organizing media interviews and things like that. And when I was called up to the CEO's office, then the whole atmosphere in that office was quite different from the atmosphere in the PR department. So even within the same company, which is a very, very large, corporate atmosphere, you're going to find different pockets that reflect different sensibilities. That was my experience anyway.
Yeah, there's human variation with any population of people, right? So you always have a bell curve. It's just where you impose it into a different situation. So that makes sense.
Yes, I have a lot of experience, dealing with these very small companies. I've never really thought about like what I was doing, and I'm from Hawaii, so I just say I'm from Hawaii, and then they seem to forgive everything.
It's true. Japanese love Hawaii.
It's the greatest icebreaker.
Ian. What island are you from?
I'm from Hawaii. I'm from Honolulu.
Right on. Cool.
Yeah, so like you start talking to them, and then they tell you about how they went to Hawaii for their honeymoon 50 years ago, and it's just like it's a great icebreaker. But and then I'm just very friendly after that. But it's not really like I've never really thought about like whether that applies. It's just my experience, or that kind of thing applies to other people. And I'm trying to like mentor this other guy, an American, who's living in Shizuoka and trying to make it in the tea industry there. And I'm sure that my experience can't really be translated to him. And I was looking for some advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I hope, Richard, that you're not too scared, not too tired, and you can.
I'm exhausted. I never want to do this again.
Oh, my dear.
Oh no.
Okay, but we can negotiate on this, I believe, right?
You're so persistent, Maya. That's
sorry. Okay.
I think Richard.
Mai muki ni kento shimasu.
All right.
That's the good one.
Yes.
And he is an American.
Yes.
So not reading between lines. He means
it.
He's a hybrid.
Right.
Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air next week on Thursday at 8 a.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we're looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make the best of the day. See you.